Marcus Chen stared at the out-of-order sign taped crookedly across the brass doors, his daughter Emma's wheelchair bumping gently against his leg as she fidgeted with impatience. The lobby of Hartwell Industries stretched around them like a cathedral of glass and marble, all soaring ceilings and echoing footsteps. But none of that mattered when you couldn't reach the 20th floor where the accessibility consultant waited. "Dad, are we going to be late?" Emma's voice carried that particular note of worry that had become too familiar since the accident 8 months ago. At 12, she developed an acute awareness of how the world failed to accommodate her new reality, and Marcus had watched his bright, fearless daughter transform into someone who apologized for existing in spaces that weren't built for her. "Never," Marcus said, though sweat was already beading on his forehead. 20 flights of stairs. Emma weighed 90 pounds, her wheelchair another 30. He'd done harder things, hadn't he? "We'll take the stairs. It'll be an adventure." Emma's laugh was hollow. "Dad, you can't carry me up 20 floors." But Marcus was already positioning himself, the way he'd learned from the physical therapist. Emma transferred to his back with practiced efficiency, her thin arms looping around his neck, and Marcus folded the wheelchair with movements that had become automatic. The chair's titanium frame was sleek, expensive, a gift from Emma's mother who lived 3 states away now and called twice a month to ask how Emma was adjusting. The stairwell smelled of industrial cleaner and neglect. Marcus's work boots echoed against concrete as he began climbing, Emma's wheelchair balanced in one arm, his other hand gripping the rail. If you're enjoying this story of determination and hope, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps support these inspiring stories. By the 3rd floor, his breathing had changed. Marcus's work boots echoed against concrete as he began climbing, Emma's wheelchair balanced in one arm, his other hand gripping the rail. By the 3rd floor, his breathing had changed. By the 7th, his shirt was soaked through. "Dad, please, we can reschedule." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. They'd rescheduled twice already. Once because Emma had a panic attack in the building's revolving door. Once because Marcus had worked a double shift and overslept. He couldn't afford to seem unreliable. This consultation could change everything for Emma's school, for the community center, for all the kids who navigated the world on wheels while the world pretended they didn't exist. On the 10th floor, Marcus had to stop. His legs shook as he set the wheelchair down, Emma sliding into it with the fluid grace she'd developed out of necessity. She didn't speak, just watched him with eyes that held too much understanding for 12 years old. 5 minutes, he gasped. "Dad." Emma's voice was quiet now, the way it got when she was about to say something that would break his heart a little more. "Maybe this isn't." The stairwell door opened on the 10th floor and a woman emerged, but not walking, rolling. A wheelchair, but not like Emma's. This one was clearly custom, built for someone who lived their life at desk height, all sleek lines and purposeful engineering. The woman in it moved with the confidence of someone who had never apologized for taking up space. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made Marcus straighten instinctively. "Are you trying to reach the upper floors?" She was beautiful in a way that made Marcus immediately aware of his sweat-stained shirt and work-rough hands. Dark hair pulled back severely, sharp business suit, eyes that seemed to catalog everything in seconds. But it was her hands that caught his attention. Confident on the wheelchair's rims, no hesitation, no self-consciousness. "The elevator's broken," Marcus said, as if this explained everything. "It's been broken for 3 days. Her tone suggested this was personally offensive to her. "I'm Victoria Hartwell. My building, my problem. Are you here for the accessibility consultation?" Marcus nodded, suddenly aware of how they must look. A maintenance worker and his disabled daughter struggling with stairs while she moved through the building like she owned it. Which, apparently, she did. "I'm Marcus Chen, this is Emma." Emma had gone quiet in the way she did around strangers, especially adults who might pity her or, worse, not see her at all. But Victoria rolled closer, stopping at Emma's eye level. "That's a beautiful chair," Victoria said, and Marcus was surprised by the genuineness in her voice. "Custom titanium frame? I was looking at that model last year, but I went with carbon fiber instead. Do you like the way it handles?" Emma blinked, clearly not expecting a technical discussion. It's okay, the turning radius is really good." "That was my concern with the titanium, may I?" Victoria gestured toward the chair and Emma nodded. Victoria ran her hands along the frame with the expertise of someone who understood engineering. "This is gorgeous work. Who did the modifications?" Dad did most of them." Emma glanced at Marcus, who felt heat rise in his cheeks. Victoria looked up at him, and something shifted in her expression. "You modified this yourself?" "Just small things. Better cup holder placement, adjustable footrests, some padding where she was getting pressure sores." "Show me." For the next 10 minutes, Marcus found himself explaining modifications he'd made by trial and error, using skills learned from years of fixing everything from restaurant equipment to heating systems. Victoria listened with an intensity that made him self-conscious, asking technical questions that revealed she understood engineering better than most professionals he'd worked with. "This is remarkable work," she said finally. "Have you considered doing this professionally?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I fix kitchen equipment for restaurants. This is just what you do for your kid." "No," Victoria said, and her voice carried a weight that made both Marcus and Emma look at her. "This is what you do when you understand that the world is broken, and you refuse to accept it." The stairwell fell quiet, except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Victoria was looking at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read, and Emma was looking between them with the sharp awareness children developed when adults were having conversations in subtext. "The consultation meeting," Victoria said suddenly. "Cancel it. I want to hire you directly." "I'm sorry?" "I need someone who understands accessibility from the ground up. Someone who's lived it, fought it, solved it with their hands, instead of just reading about it and building codes." Victoria's eyes moved to Emma, then back to Marcus. "I need someone who gets angry at broken elevators and figures out how to carry their daughter up 20 flights of stairs instead of giving up." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. "Ms. Hartwell, I appreciate." "Victoria, and I'm not being charitable." Her voice had turned businesslike, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost vulnerable. "I'm being selfish. I need help, and you need a job that pays better than restaurant equipment repair. Emma needs a world that works for her. We all get what we need." Emma was staring at Victoria with fascination now, and Marcus realized his daughter was seeing something he'd been trying to give her for months, an adult who was disabled and powerful, successful and unapologetic, someone who made accessibility look like strength instead of accommodation. "What kind of help?" Marcus asked. Victoria smiled, and it transformed her face completely. "The kind where we fix everything that's broken. Starting with my elevator, moving on to every building in this city that thinks stairs are the only way up." She paused, her eyes holding his. "And maybe some other broken things along the way." The stairwell door opened again, and a young man in an expensive suit appeared, looking harried. "Victoria, the board meeting." "Oh." He stopped, taking in the scene. "Sorry, I didn't realize." "David, meet Marcus Chen and his daughter Emma. Marcus is going to be our new director of accessibility solutions." Marcus's mouth opened to protest, but Victoria continued smoothly. "Marcus, this is my assistant David. David, please have facilities fix the elevator immediately. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. And have legal draw up a contract for Marcus. Full benefits, starting salary at $90,000, company car." David blinked. "Victoria, I don't think we have a director of—" "We do now." Victoria's voice brooked no argument. "Emma, would you like to see my office while your father and I discuss details? I have a feeling you'd have some very good ideas about how to make this building work better for everyone." Emma looked at Marcus, who felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Everything about this was impossible. The job, the salary, the way Victoria spoke like she could reshape reality through pure will. But Emma's eyes were bright for the first time in months, and Victoria was looking at him like she saw something worth investing in. "Why?" he asked quietly. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested depths Marcus couldn't yet fathom. "Because 8 months ago I was in a car accident that changed everything I thought I knew about how the world works. Because I've spent those 8 months learning that being powerful and being disabled aren't opposites. They're just two facts that have to coexist. And because I think you understand something about fixing broken things that I need to learn." She paused, her eyes holding his. "And because that elevator has been broken for 3 days, and not one person in this building thought to mention it to me, but you carried your daughter up 10 flights of stairs rather than give up on what she needed." Her voice softened slightly. That's the kind of problem-solving I want on my team. Marcus looked at Emma, who was watching this exchange with the intensity of someone who understood that their life was balanced on the edge of this moment. Then he looked at Victoria, who was waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, but not through force, through making what she wanted make sense. "When do I start?" he asked. Victoria's smile was radiant. "How about now? David, show them to the 20th floor. Use the freight elevator. It actually works." As they made their way through the building, Marcus found himself walking beside Victoria's wheelchair, Emma rolling alongside them, chattering excitedly about accessible design features she'd noticed. For the first time in months, his daughter sounded like herself again, curious, engaged, unafraid to take up space. But as the freight elevator climbed toward the 20th floor, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria's offer came with complications he couldn't yet see. There had been something in her voice when she mentioned her accident, something that suggested her story was more complex than a simple car crash and recovery. And there had been something in the way she looked at him, not just professional interest, but something that made his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with climbing stairs and everything to do with the woman who had just changed his life with a 10-minute conversation in a stairwell. "Dad," Emma whispered as the elevator climbed, "do you think she's going to be okay?" "What do you mean?" Emma glanced at Victoria, who was deep in conversation with David about building codes and compliance schedules. She seems sad underneath, like she's trying really hard to not be sad. Marcus looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and realized his 12-year-old daughter had seen something he'd missed. Beneath the confidence and authority, there was something fragile, something that suggested Victoria Hartwell's story was far from over. The elevator stopped at the 20th floor with a gentle ding, and the doors opened onto a world of floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek modern furniture. But Marcus barely noticed the view. He was watching Victoria navigate her domain with easy competence, and wondering what it had cost her to build this life, and what she might need from him that had nothing to do with accessibility consulting and everything to do with the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Marcus's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., the same as it had every day for the past 8 months. But this morning was different. Instead of reaching for his work clothes, the steel-toed boots and canvas pants that smelled perpetually of fryer oil and industrial cleaner, he found himself staring at the business-casual outfit Victoria's assistant had recommended. Khakis, and a button-down shirt that still had creases from the package. Emma was already awake when he knocked on her door, sitting in bed with her laptop balanced on a tray table he'd built to the exact height of her mattress. She'd been an early riser before the accident, but now she woke at dawn out of necessity. The morning routine of transfers, medications, and careful attention to circulation took time they'd both had to learn to budget. "First day of the new job," she said, looking up from her screen. She'd been researching Hartwell Industries until past midnight, creating what she called a strategic briefing, with the serious intensity she brought to everything now. "Did you know Victoria's company has contracts with half the city? And that she's only 28? Marcus paused in the doorway. 28? Younger than you." Emma grinned, and for a moment she looked like the kid who used to tease him about his carefully hidden crush on her third-grade teacher. And she inherited the company when she was 25 after her father died. Car accident happened 6 months later. "Emma," Marcus's voice carried a warning, "we don't know anything about her personal life." "Dad, it's all public record. Forbes did a whole article about her." Emma turned the laptop toward him, and Marcus found himself looking at a photo of Victoria from before the accident. Same sharp intelligence in her eyes, but something different in her posture. Looser, more casual. She was standing next to a man with kind eyes and graying temples, both of them holding a groundbreaking shovel at some construction site. "Her dad started the company in the 80s, Emma continued, scrolling through the article. "They specialized in commercial construction, mostly office buildings and shopping centers. Pretty standard stuff until Victoria took over and started focusing on adaptive design. Look at this." Marcus found himself drawn into the laptop screen despite his reservations. Victoria had transformed her father's traditional construction company into something that looked more like a tech startup crossed with an architecture firm. The projects showcased on their website were beautiful and functional, designed around the idea that accessibility wasn't an afterthought but a fundamental principle. "She's revolutionizing how buildings interact with human movement," Emma read aloud. "That's such a cool way to think about it. Not disabled people needing special accommodations, but buildings that work for how humans actually move through space." Marcus sat on the edge of Emma's bed, studying the photos. In every image from after the accident, Victoria looked composed and professional, but there was something in her posture, a careful control that suggested she was managing more than just business operations. "What happened in the accident?" he asked, though he immediately regretted the question. Emma's expression grew serious. "The article doesn't say much. Just that she was critically injured and spent 3 months in rehabilitation. But Dad, look at this." She clicked to another tab, showing a news article from 2 years ago. She was engaged to someone named Jonathan Pierce. He was a doctor at Seattle General. The engagement ended right after the accident. Marcus felt something twist in his chest, though he couldn't name what it was. Before we continue with Marcus and Victoria's story, if this tale of resilience is touching your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. That's enough research for one morning. We should get ready. That's enough research for one morning. We should get ready. But as they went through their morning routine, Emma transferring to her shower chair while Marcus made breakfast, both of them navigating the narrow hallway of their apartment with the choreographed precision they'd developed, Marcus found himself thinking about Victoria's story, about the weight of taking over a company at 25, of rebuilding your life and your body simultaneously, of learning to be powerful in a world that wanted to see you as diminished. Emma's school pickup was at 7:15, which gave Marcus just enough time to drive across town to Hartwell Industries. As he pushed Emma's wheelchair up the ramp to Lincoln Middle School, he noticed things he'd missed before. The way the handrails were positioned too low for adult use, how the automatic door was slow enough that faster wheelchair users would bump into it, the lack of turning space in the main hallway. "You're already thinking like an accessibility consultant," Emma observed, watching him catalog problems. "Is it that obvious? You've got that look, like when you're troubleshooting the ice machine at Romano's." Emma rolled toward the entrance, then paused. "Dad? Are you nervous?" Marcus considered lying, but Emma had developed an ability to read his moods that sometimes unsettled him. "A little." "Because of the job, or because of Victoria?" The question was delivered with the casual precision Emma had inherited from her mother, the ability to identify exactly what someone was trying not to think about and bring it into the light. "The job," Marcus said firmly. Emma smiled in a way that suggested she didn't believe him but would let it slide. "She likes you." "She likes my work. There's a difference." "Dad, I've seen how people look at your work. The therapists at rehab, the equipment vendors, even Mom when she visited. They look impressed, sometimes surprised, but they don't look at you the way Victoria did yesterday." Marcus felt heat rise in his face. "How did she look at me?" "Like she was trying to figure out if you were real." Emma's voice had gone soft, almost wistful. "Like she'd been looking for something and wasn't sure she'd found it until she saw you." Before Marcus could respond, Emma's friend Jasmine appeared, wheelchair racing toward them with the fearless speed that reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with adaptive sports. The two girls fell into easy conversation about their upcoming science project, and Marcus found himself watching the way they navigated social space. How they'd learned to position their chairs to include standing classmates. How they'd developed their own language of gesture and movement. "Mr. Chen?" Jasmine's mother, Patricia, approached with the careful smile parents used when they weren't sure how to talk about disability. "Emma mentioned you got a new job? That's wonderful." "Thank you." Marcus found himself reluctant to share details, partly out of superstition and partly because he still couldn't quite believe it was real. "Working with disabled kids?" Patricia's voice carried the particular tone people used when they assumed all disability-related work was charitable. "Accessibility consulting. For commercial buildings and public spaces." Patricia's expression shifted, and Marcus realized she was recalibrating her assumptions. "That sounds important." "It is," Emma said firmly. "Dad's going to make sure places work for everyone, not just people who walk." As Marcus drove toward downtown, Emma's words echoed in his mind. She'd said it so simply, places should work for everyone. But the simplicity hid enormous complexity, years of advocacy and legislation, and still insufficient progress. Marcus had learned this firsthand over the past 8 months. watching Emma navigate a world that accommodated her existence grudgingly and incompletely. The Hartwell Industries building looked different in morning light, less imposing and more purposeful. Marcus parked in the garage and took the working elevator to the 20th floor, where David met him with a stack of paperwork and an apologetic expression. "Victoria's in meetings until 10, David explained, leading Marcus through a maze of open workstations toward a corner office. "But she wanted you to get started right away. This is your office." Marcus stopped in the doorway. The space was larger than his apartment's living room, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The desk was adjustable height, the shelving accessible from a seated position. Even the lighting was designed to minimize glare on computer screens. "She had it redesigned over the weekend," David said, misreading Marcus's silence. "If anything doesn't work, just let me know." "It's perfect," Marcus said quietly. "It's just, this is really happening." David's expression softened. Victoria doesn't do anything halfway. When she decides she wants something, she tends to rearrange reality around it. He paused. "Fair warning. She's brilliant and demanding and sometimes forgets that other people need sleep. But she's also the best boss I've ever had, and I think you're going to do amazing work here." Marcus spent the morning reviewing building plans and accessibility audits, trying to understand the scope of what Victoria wanted to accomplish. It wasn't just compliance with ADA requirements. She was envisioning a complete reimagining of how buildings related to human movement. Universal design principles applied not as afterthoughts, but as foundational elements. At 10:30, Victoria appeared in his doorway. She looked different than she had the day before, softer somehow, though no less professional. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore a sweater that brought out the green in her eyes. "How's the office?" she asked, rolling into the space with easy familiarity. "Incredible, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see your project list." Victoria moved closer to his desk, and Marcus caught a hint of her perfume, something light and sophisticated that made him hyper-aware of her proximity. "I want to start with the Morrison Building downtown. 22 floors, built in 1987, completely inaccessible above the 3rd floor. The owners want to renovate rather than rebuild, and they've hired us to make it work." Marcus opened the building plans Victoria handed him and immediately saw the problems. Narrow doorways, bathroom facilities that couldn't accommodate wheelchairs, elevator systems that were adequate for the 1980s but inadequate for current accessibility standards. "This is going to be expensive," he said. "Yes, but not as expensive as a discrimination lawsuit, and significantly less expensive than demolition and reconstruction." Victoria leaned closer to point out specific issues on the blueprints, and Marcus found himself distracted by the way her hand moved confidently across the technical drawings. "What's your initial assessment?" Marcus forced himself to focus on the plans rather than the woman explaining them. "The elevator systems need complete replacement. You'd have to reconfigure the bathroom layouts on every floor. Some of these hallways are too narrow. You'd need to move walls, which means reconfiguring office spaces." "Exactly. The owners think they can solve this with a few ramps and wider bathroom stalls. I need you to show them why that won't work." "And if they decide the renovation isn't worth the cost?" Victoria's smile was sharp. "Then they'll discover that I have considerable influence with the city planning department, and that their building permits for other projects might face unexpected delays." Marcus looked up from the blueprints, and Victoria's expression grew more serious. "I don't make empty threats, Marcus, but I also don't accept too expensive as an excuse for keeping buildings inaccessible. There are 12,000 people in this city who use wheelchairs, and hundreds of thousands more who would benefit from universal design principles. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal access to public spaces." The passion in her voice reminded Marcus of Emma's advocacy presentations at school, the way his daughter had learned to argue for accommodation without apology. But there was something else in Victoria's tone, something that sounded like barely controlled anger. "What made you decide to focus on accessibility?" he asked. Victoria was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently straightening papers on his desk. "Before the accident, I thought accessibility was a regulatory requirement. Something you dealt with to avoid lawsuits. I had no idea what it actually meant, to navigate the world when the world isn't built for your body." She paused, and Marcus saw something vulnerable flicker across her expression. "The first time I tried to go to dinner after I got out of rehabilitation, the restaurant had one step at the entrance. One step. The hostess kept apologizing and offering to help me hop up the step, as if I just needed a little boost, instead of a fundamental change in how their entrance was designed. Marcus had lived versions of this story with Emma, the well-meaning offers of help that missed the point entirely, the assumptions that accommodation was about individual assistance rather than systemic design. What did you do? I left, and then I went home and cried for 3 hours because I realized how much of the world had become inaccessible to me. Victoria's voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the cost of that steadiness. And then I got angry. Really, properly angry. The kind of angry that gets things done. She looked up at him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The fierce protectiveness he'd developed for Emma, the refusal to accept limitations that were imposed rather than inherent. That's when I decided to change the company's focus. If I was going to live in this world, I was going to make sure it worked for people like me, people like Emma. The mention of his daughter's name sent warmth through Marcus's chest. She's already planning to be an accessibility advocate when she grows up. Says she wants to design theme parks that are fun for everyone. Victoria's smile was radiant. Smart girl. They spent the next hour planning comprehensive accessibility improvements. But as they worked, Marcus became increasingly aware of the way Victoria moved through her environment. Everything was calculated for efficiency and independence. Her office setup, her filing system, even the way she positioned herself in conversations, all designed to maintain control and minimize the need for assistance. "Victoria," he said during a pause in their planning, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever take breaks, let people help you?" Victoria's expression shifted, and Marcus immediately regretted the question. "I don't need help." "That's not what I meant. Marcus struggled to find words that wouldn't sound patronizing. Emma had to learn that accepting help isn't the same as being helpless. That sometimes letting people care about you is its own kind of strength. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her wheelchair's armrest. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it before. "After the accident, everyone wanted to help. My mother flew in from Portland and tried to move in with me. My friends organized meal trains and house cleaning services. Jonathan, my fiancé, took leave from the hospital to be my full-time caregiver." She paused, and Marcus saw pain flicker across her features. "And I hated it. Every offer of help felt like confirmation that I wasn't the person I used to be. That I'd become someone who needed to be taken care of instead of someone who took care of things. What happened with Jonathan? He wanted to marry me anyway." Victoria's laugh was hollow. "He kept saying the accident didn't change how he felt about me, that we'd figure it out together. But I could see it in his eyes. He was grieving the person I used to be. The woman who could hike with him on weekends, who could dance at our wedding, who could give him the life he'd planned on." Marcus felt something ache in his chest. Maybe he was just scared. People don't always know how to handle big changes. "Maybe." Victoria's voice was distant. "But I couldn't spend my life being someone's brave inspiration or their noble burden. So I ended the engagement, threw myself into rebuilding the company, and learned to do everything myself." The silence stretched between them, and Marcus found himself wanting to say something that would ease the pain he could see in Victoria's posture. But before he could find the words, David appeared in the doorway. "Victoria, the Morrison building owners are here for the 11:30 meeting." Victoria straightened, and Marcus watched her transform back into the composed executive he'd first met. But now he could see the effort it required, the careful construction of confidence and control. "Ready to show them why they need us?" she asked Marcus, and her smile was sharp and professional again. As they made their way to the conference room, Marcus found himself thinking about what Victoria had said about learning to do everything herself. He understood the impulse. After Emma's accident, he'd thrown himself into becoming expert at wheelchair maintenance, transfer techniques, adaptive equipment. Independence had felt like the only way to protect his daughter from a world that saw her as diminished. But watching Victoria navigate the meeting, presenting technical solutions with brilliant competence while carefully managing every aspect of her positioning and presentation, Marcus realized that total self-reliance could become its own kind of prison. The Morrison building owners were exactly what Marcus had expected, middle-aged men in expensive suits who spoke about accessibility in terms of liability management rather than human dignity. Victoria dismantled their assumptions with surgical precision, using Marcus's technical expertise to demonstrate why their proposed minimal modifications wouldn't meet legal requirements or functional needs. "The Americans with Disabilities Act isn't a suggestion," Victoria said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "And neither is basic human decency. You can choose to make your building genuinely accessible, or you can choose to face discrimination lawsuits from tenants who can't reach their offices. But you can't choose to ignore the problem and hope it resolves itself." Marcus watched the men exchange glances, clearly uncomfortable with Victoria's directness. One of them, the older man who'd introduced himself as the senior partner, leaned forward with the kind of condescending smile Marcus had seen too often. "Miss Hartwell, we appreciate your personal investment in this issue, but we need to consider practical limitations and cost-benefit analysis." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw her hands tighten on her wheelchair's armrests. "My personal investment," Victoria said slowly, "is in creating spaces that work for all users, not just those who happen to match your assumptions about normal human movement. Would you like to see the cost-benefit analysis of losing 12% of your potential tenant base because they can't physically access your building?" The meeting continued for another hour, with Marcus providing technical details while Victoria managed the strategic negotiation. By the end, the building owners had agreed to the full renovation plan, though their reluctance was obvious. As they left the conference room, Marcus found himself walking beside Victoria again, matching her pace automatically. "You handled that brilliantly," he said. Victoria's smile was tired. "I've had practice. Amazing how many people think my disability makes me less capable of understanding business strategy." "Is that what you meant about learning to do everything yourself?" Victoria paused in the hallway, and Marcus saw something vulnerable flicker across her expression again. "Partly. When people see the wheelchair before they see me, I have to prove my competence every single day. There's no room for uncertainty or weakness or asking for help, because any sign of limitation gets attributed to my disability rather than normal human complexity." Marcus thought about Emma's recent struggles with self-advocacy, how his daughter had learned to be twice as prepared as her classmates, twice as articulate, twice as confident, because any stumble would be seen as confirmation that she didn't belong in mainstream classes. "That sounds exhausting," he said quietly. "It is." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "But the alternative is accepting that I'm somehow less than I was before. And I refuse to do that." They stood in the hallway for a moment, and Marcus found himself seeing Victoria not as the powerful executive who changed his life with a 10-minute conversation, but as someone who'd built her strength out of necessity and maintained it through sheer force of will. "Victoria," he said carefully, "what if accepting help didn't mean accepting limitation? What if it just meant accepting that you don't have to carry everything alone?" Victoria looked up at him, and for a moment her professional composure slipped entirely. Marcus saw exhaustion, loneliness, and something that looked like longing. "I don't know how to do that anymore," she said. Before Marcus could respond, David appeared with a stack of phone messages and a concerned expression, and Victoria straightened back into executive mode. But as they returned to the business of building renovation and accessibility consulting, Marcus carried with him the image of Victoria's unguarded moment. The woman beneath the professional competence, who'd learned to be invulnerable because vulnerability had cost her everything she'd thought she wanted. And he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was ready to learn that strength and softness weren't opposites, but partners in the complicated dance of living a fully human life. 3 weeks into his new job, Marcus was beginning to understand the scope of what Victoria was fighting against. It wasn't just individual buildings. It was an entire infrastructure of assumption. The revelation came during what should have been a routine site inspection at the new downtown transit center. Marcus arrived early, as had become his habit, and spent 20 minutes documenting problems that would have been invisible to most people, but were devastating barriers to anyone who navigated the world on wheels. The elevator buttons were positioned too high for someone in a wheelchair to reach comfortably. The accessible parking spaces were located in the section farthest from the building entrance. The emergency evacuation plan made no provisions for people who couldn't use stairs. Victoria arrived exactly on time, rolling through the parking garage with the efficiency that had become familiar to Marcus over their weeks of working together. She wore another of her precisely professional outfits, tailored blazer, silk blouse, subtle jewelry that somehow managed to suggest both elegance and authority. But Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs of her mood, and today, something was off. Her movements were sharper than usual, her smile more brittle. "How bad is it?" she asked without preamble. "Bad, but fixable if they're willing to make changes before the opening ceremony next month." Victoria's laugh was hollow. "They're not. I've been fielding calls from the city manager all morning. Apparently asking for ADA compliance constitutes unreasonable demands and, quote, costly delays." Marcus felt familiar anger rise in his chest, the same protective fury he'd developed watching Emma navigate systems that seemed designed to exclude her. What's their argument? The budget is already stretched. The opening date is fixed. The modifications we're requesting would require reworking electrical systems and reconfiguring the main entrance. Victoria's voice carried the weary tone of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. All the usual excuses for why accessibility is impossible instead of inevitable. They spent the morning documenting violations and drafting remediation plans. Marcus had become skilled at translating his practical understanding of adaptive equipment into technical specifications that contractors could understand. Victoria transformed those specifications into legal requirements that clients couldn't ignore. Together, they formed a partnership that was both professionally effective and personally satisfying in ways Marcus was only beginning to acknowledge. But by lunchtime, it was clear that their technical competence wasn't going to be enough. The city manager arrived with 2 assistants and an attitude that made Marcus's teeth ache. "Ms. Hartwell," the man said, extending a hand that Victoria shook with professional courtesy. "I'm Robert Kellerman. I understand you have some concerns about our new facility." Concerns. As if legal violations were matters of opinion rather than federal law. "Mr. Kellerman," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the particular crispness that Marcus had learned meant she was containing significant anger. "I have documentation of 17 ADA violations in a publicly funded facility that's scheduled to open in 3 weeks. These aren't concerns. They're legal requirements you failed to meet." Kellerman's smile was the kind Marcus recognized from dealing with restaurant managers who thought health code violations were negotiable. "I appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to be realistic about timelines and budgets. Perhaps we could implement some of these suggestions in a later phase of development." Suggestions. Victoria's voice was deadly quiet. "Mr. Kellerman, are you familiar with the case law surrounding ADA compliance in public facilities?" "Ms. Hartwell, I understand you have a personal interest in these issues." "Stop." Victoria's hand came up, and her expression shifted to something that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. "Do not finish that sentence. My qualifications for this consultation have nothing to do with my personal circumstances and everything to do with my professional expertise in accessibility compliance and universal design principles." Kellerman had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he pressed on with the obtuse persistence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who couldn't fire him. "Of course, I didn't mean to imply. You implied exactly what you meant to imply. That my disability makes me emotionally compromised rather than professionally qualified." Victoria rolled closer to Kellerman, and Marcus saw him instinctively step backward. "Let me be very clear about something, Mr. Kellerman. I am not asking you to make this building accessible out of charity or personal accommodation. I'm telling you that federal law requires it, that my company was hired specifically to ensure compliance, and that opening a non-compliant facility will result in immediate legal action. Now see here." "No, you see here." Victoria's voice carried authority that filled the space around them. "This facility was built with federal funding. That means it falls under strict ADA compliance requirements, not suggestions or guidelines or things we'll get to eventually. Requirements. As in mandatory. As in the Justice Department has the authority to shut you down before your opening ceremony if you proceed with a non-compliant facility." Marcus watched Kellerman's assistants exchange nervous glances. One of them, a younger woman with intelligent eyes, stepped forward. "Ms. Hartwell, could you provide us with a prioritized list of the most critical violations? Perhaps we could address the highest priority items within the existing timeline." Victoria turned to the woman, and her expression softened slightly. Thank you for asking a practical question instead of questioning my qualifications. Marcus, would you walk through the Priority 1 violations? For the next hour, Marcus found himself explaining technical modifications to a group that ranged from genuinely interested to openly hostile. The young assistant, who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, which made Marcus wonder if they might be distantly related, took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions. Kellerman spent most of the time checking his phone and making comments about overregulation and bureaucratic overreach. But it was the third man, introduced as the project's lead contractor, who proved to be the real problem. "Look," he said, interrupting Marcus's explanation of proper elevator button placement, "I've been building public facilities for 20 years, and I've never had complaints about accessibility before." Marcus felt Victoria tense beside him. "That doesn't mean your buildings have been accessible. It means people who couldn't use them found other options or went without services entirely." "That's a pretty big assumption," the contractor replied. "Maybe the problem isn't with the buildings. Maybe it's with people expecting the world to be redesigned around their limitations." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Victoria's face had gone completely blank, which Marcus had learned was far more dangerous than visible anger. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could you repeat that?" The contractor, apparently oblivious to the warning signs, doubled down. "I'm just saying, there's a difference between reasonable accommodation and complete capitulation to special interest groups. Most disabled people learn to adapt to the world as it is, instead of demanding that everything be rebuilt to suit them." Marcus felt something snap inside his chest. This was Emma's future this man was dismissing. Her right to access public spaces, to participate in community life, to exist in the world without apology. Before he could stop himself, he was stepping forward. "Most disabled people," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge he usually reserved for restaurant managers who tried to shortchange his invoices, "spend their entire lives adapting to a world that treats their existence as an inconvenience. They learn to navigate buildings with stairs instead of ramps, bathrooms they can't fit into, elevators that don't work, parking spaces that are too narrow, and people who think asking for basic accessibility is asking for special treatment." The contractor opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. "My daughter is 12 years old. She's brilliant and funny and brave, and she uses a wheelchair because a drunk driver decided her life was less important than his convenience. She's spent the last 8 months learning to advocate for herself in a world that constantly tells her she's asking for too much. So when you say disabled people should just adapt to the world as it is, what you're really saying is that my daughter should accept that her citizenship is conditional on her ability to overcome obstacles that shouldn't exist in the first place." Marcus realized he was trembling with anger, his hands clenched at his sides. The contractor was staring at him with a mixture of surprise and defensiveness, and Kellerman looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. But it was Victoria's expression that stopped Marcus cold. She was looking at him with something that went far beyond professional appreciation, something that looked like recognition, like gratitude, like the beginning of trust. "Furthermore," Victoria said, picking up where Marcus had left off with seamless precision, "the ADA isn't a special interest law. It's civil rights legislation that guarantees equal access to public accommodations for all Americans. When you build a non-compliant facility, you're not just breaking federal law, you're actively excluding American citizens from participating in their own democracy." Sarah Chen cleared her throat. "If we prioritize the elevator modifications and entrance reconfiguration, what's the realistic timeline for compliance?" Marcus pulled himself back into professional mode, though his pulse was still racing. 2 weeks if we start immediately. The electrical work is the most complex part, but it's not impossible." "And the cost?" Kellerman asked, though he looked like he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. "Approximately $200,000 for full compliance," Victoria said, "which is less than 5% of your total project budget, and significantly less than the fines you'll face if you open a non-compliant facility." $200,000, the contractor muttered, for a handful of disabled people who might use the facility. This time, Victoria's composure cracked completely. "A handful?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "There are 12,000 wheelchair users in this city, 60,000 people who use mobility aids of some kind, 200,000 people who would benefit from universal design principles. But even if there were only one person who needed accessible design, that person's civil rights would be exactly as important as yours. She rolled closer to the contractor, and Marcus saw him instinctively step backward. Let me tell you something about that handful of disabled people, since you seem so concerned about cost-benefit analysis. We represent 26% of the adult population. We have a combined annual income of $13 billion. We vote, we pay taxes, we start businesses, we raise families, and we contribute to our communities in every way that matters. The only thing we can't do is access buildings that people like you design without thinking about how humans actually move through space. Victoria paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. But here's what really matters. Accessibility isn't about accommodating a minority population. It's about designing spaces that work for human bodies as they actually exist, not as we imagine they should exist. Curb cuts help wheelchair users, but they also help parents with strollers, delivery workers with dollies, travelers with suitcases, and anyone who's ever had a temporary injury. Elevator access helps people who can't climb stairs, but it also helps people carrying heavy loads or dealing with mobility limitations that aren't visible. Good lighting and clear signage help people with visual impairments, but they help everyone navigate spaces more easily. She gestured toward the transit center around them. You can build this facility to work for some people, or you can build it to work for all people. The cost difference is minimal, the moral difference is enormous. And the legal difference could shut you down before you ever open your doors. The contractor was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see him recalculating his position. Sarah Chen was taking notes furiously, and even Kellerman looked like he was beginning to understand that this wasn't a negotiation he was going to win. "What's the next step?" Sarah asked. Victoria looked at Marcus, and he saw something pass between them, a recognition that they'd moved beyond professional partnership into something that felt like shared purpose. Marcus will provide detailed specifications for Priority 1 modifications by tomorrow morning, Victoria said. You'll have until Friday to confirm that work will begin immediately. If we don't have written commitment by end of business Friday, I'll be filing complaints with the Justice Department and the State Attorney General on Monday morning. That seems aggressive, Kellerman said weakly. Mr. Kellerman, Victoria replied, you've had 18 months to ensure ADA compliance during construction. Aggressive would have been involving federal oversight from the beginning. I'm giving you an opportunity to fix this before it becomes a much larger and more expensive problem. The meeting ended with stiff handshakes and promises of rapid communication. As the city officials left, Marcus found himself alone with Victoria in the echoing space of the incomplete transit center. Thank you, Victoria said quietly. For what? For understanding that this isn't about accommodation, it's about justice. Victoria was looking out at the construction equipment scattered around the site, but Marcus could see tension in her shoulders that suggested the conversation had cost her more than she was letting on. Most people think accessibility advocacy is about being nice to disabled people. They don't understand that it's about fundamental civil rights. Marcus thought about Emma's recent presentation to her class about universal design, how she'd explained that accessibility benefited everyone, not just people with disabilities. His daughter had learned to frame her needs in terms of broader social good, and Marcus was beginning to understand how exhausting that must be. You shouldn't have to justify your right to exist in public spaces, he said. Victoria turned to look at him, and Marcus saw something vulnerable flicker across her expression. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. The constant fighting, the endless explanations, the way every request for basic accommodation gets treated like an unreasonable demand. What makes you keep going? Victoria was quiet for a moment, absently adjusting the position of her wheelchair. Emma. Marcus felt something warm and complicated move through his chest. Emma. Not just Emma specifically, though she's remarkable. All the Emmas. The kids who are growing up in a world that tells them their bodies are problems to be solved instead of realities to be accommodated. If I can make the world work better for them, then maybe they won't have to spend their entire lives fighting for the right to participate in their own communities. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer. And maybe they won't have to choose between accepting help and maintaining their dignity. Maybe they'll grow up in a world where accessibility is just part of how things work, instead of a special favor that has to be negotiated for every single time. Marcus found himself thinking about the moment 3 weeks ago when Victoria had offered him a job after watching him carry Emma up 10 flights of stairs. At the time, he'd thought she was impressed by his problem-solving skills. Now he was beginning to understand that she'd seen something else. A father who refused to accept that the world didn't work for his daughter, who was willing to carry her as far as necessary rather than teach her to limit her expectations. "Victoria," he said carefully, "what you said about choosing between help and dignity." "I know what I said." Victoria's voice carried a warning that Marcus almost heeded. Almost. What if it's not a choice? What if accepting help is just part of building the kind of world you're trying to create? Victoria was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to need people anymore, Marcus. After the accident, everyone wanted to take care of me, and all I could see was pity. Even Jonathan. Especially Jonathan. He looked at me like I was broken, like I was someone who needed to be protected instead of someone who could protect others." She paused, and Marcus saw her hands tighten on her wheelchair's armrests. "So I learned to not need anyone. I learned to do everything myself, to never ask for help, to never show weakness or uncertainty or vulnerability. Because the alternative was accepting that I'd become someone diminished." Marcus thought about the past 3 weeks, watching Victoria navigate professional challenges with brilliant competence while maintaining careful distance from everyone around her. Even with him, even when they were working in perfect partnership, she maintained a boundary that suggested intimacy was dangerous. "What if," he said carefully, "needing people isn't about being diminished? What if it's just about being human?" Victoria looked up at him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that looked like longing and terror in equal measure. "I don't know how to trust that," she said. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma's school. "Medical emergency. Please come immediately." Marcus's world tilted sideways. Emma had been fine that morning. Tired, maybe, but fine. She'd been excited about her science presentation, nervous about the upcoming wheelchair basketball tryouts, full of 12-year-old concerns and enthusiasms. "Marcus?" Victoria's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's wrong?" "Emma." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Something's wrong with Emma." Victoria's expression shifted immediately from personal vulnerability to professional competence. "Go, right now. I'll handle everything here." Marcus was already moving toward the exit, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Infection, equipment failure, seizure, allergic reaction, any of the dozen medical complications that could arise from spinal cord injury. "Marcus." Victoria's voice stopped him at the door. "Call me as soon as you know something. I'll be waiting." He looked back at her, sitting in the empty transit center surrounded by construction equipment and accessibility violations, and realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, Victoria had become more than his boss or his professional partner. She'd become someone he trusted with his fears, someone whose concern for Emma felt as fierce and protective as his own. "Thank you," he said, and then he was running toward his car, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried not to imagine all the ways his world could be falling apart while he was arguing about elevator buttons and entrance ramps. But as he drove toward Emma's school, Marcus carried with him the image of Victoria's expression when she'd told him to go, not pity or professional sympathy, but the raw concern of someone who understood exactly what it meant to fear for someone you loved in a world that wasn't built to keep them safe. The hospital waiting room smelled of disinfectant and barely contained panic. Marcus sat in a plastic chair that had been designed by someone who'd never spent hours waiting for news about someone they loved, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Emma had been in surgery for 3 hours. Something about a shunt malfunction, cerebrospinal fluid pressure, words that the emergency room doctor had delivered with practiced compassion that somehow made them more terrifying rather than less. Marcus's phone had been buzzing steadily for the past hour. Missed calls from Victoria, text messages he couldn't bring himself to read, voicemails he'd check later when he could handle hearing concern in someone else's voice. Right now, all his attention was focused on the double doors marked authorized personnel only, waiting for someone in scrubs to emerge with news about his daughter. "Mr. Chen?" A nurse appeared beside his chair and Marcus's heart stopped completely. "Dr. Martinez would like to speak with you." Marcus followed the nurse through corridors that seemed designed to disorient families in crisis, past rooms full of expensive equipment that hummed and beeped with electronic precision. Dr. Martinez was younger than Marcus had expected, with tired eyes and the kind of gentle competence that came from delivering both good news and devastating news with equal skill. "Emma is stable," Dr. Martinez said, and Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. The shunt replacement was successful. She's in recovery now, and she should be fully conscious within the hour. "Can I see her?" "In a few minutes. But first, I want to talk to you about what happened." Dr. Martinez gestured toward two chairs in an alcove that offered a simulacrum of privacy. "Emma's shunt failed because of increased intracranial pressure. That's not uncommon in pediatric cases, but what concerns me is that Emma waited almost 6 hours before telling anyone she was experiencing symptoms." Marcus felt guilt settle in his chest like a physical weight. "She didn't say anything this morning. She seemed fine." "Mr. Chen, this isn't your fault, but I need you to understand that Emma has developed a pattern of minimizing her symptoms. According to her teachers, she's been having headaches for weeks but insisting they were just stress from school. She's been experiencing vision changes but attributing them to needing new glasses. Classic signs of shunt malfunction, but she was interpreting them as normal inconveniences rather than medical emergencies." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing Emma's recent behavior through this new lens. The way she'd been squinting at her homework, the extra naps she'd been taking, the headaches she'd mentioned casually and then dismissed when he'd offered medication. Why wouldn't she tell me? Dr. Martinez's expression grew gentle. "Because she's 12 years old, and she's learned that being sick or needing medical attention makes her different from her peers. Because she's watched you work incredibly hard to create a normal life for her, and she doesn't want to be the reason that normal life gets disrupted." The doctor paused, and Marcus could see her choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Chen, Emma is a remarkable child. She's intelligent, articulate, and incredibly mature for her age, but she's also learned to be hyper-responsible for managing her disability in ways that sometimes work against her medical needs. She told the surgical team that she didn't want to worry anyone, that she thought she could handle the symptoms until they went away on their own." But now he was wondering if what he'd seen as strength was actually a 12-year-old child taking on adult responsibilities because she was afraid of being a burden. "What do I do?" he asked. "Help her understand that needing medical care isn't a failure of independence, that asking for help when she's in pain isn't the same as giving up control over her life." Dr. Martinez's voice was kind but firm. "And maybe consider that some of the pressure she feels to be self-sufficient might be coming from watching how hard you've been working to prove that her life can be completely normal." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on ensuring that Emma never felt limited by her disability that he'd perhaps inadvertently taught her that needing accommodation was a sign of weakness rather than a practical reality. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Martinez said, misreading his silence. "The surgery was successful, and recovery should be straightforward. But I want you to think about ways to help Emma see asking for help as a strength rather than a limitation." Marcus nodded, though his mind was reeling with implications he wasn't ready to process. "Can I see her now?" Emma was awake when Marcus entered the recovery room, though she looked smaller and more vulnerable than he'd seen her since the immediate aftermath of the accident. Her hair was messed from surgery, and there was an IV in her arm that made Marcus's chest tighten with protective fury. "Dad?" Emma's voice was hoarse from the anesthesia, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Hey, sweetheart." Marcus sat in the chair beside her bed, taking her hand carefully to avoid disturbing the IV. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck. Again." Emma's attempt at humor fell flat, and Marcus could see tears gathering in her eyes. "Dad, I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" "For not telling you about the headaches. For making you leave work. For—" Emma's voice broke, and suddenly she was crying with the devastating honesty of a 12-year-old who'd been trying to be brave for too long. "For being broken again." Marcus felt his heart crack completely. "Emma, sweetheart, you're not broken. You had a medical complication that required treatment. That doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. But you were just starting to like your new job, and Victoria is counting on you for the transit center project. And I ruined everything by getting sick." Marcus realized with horrible clarity that Emma had absorbed his stress about work transitions, his anxiety about proving himself professionally, his determination to show that their family could handle anything without missing a beat. She'd learned to see her medical needs as obstacles to his success rather than simply part of their life together. Emma, listen to me very carefully. Marcus leaned forward, making eye contact with his daughter. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important to me than you being healthy and safe. Not work, not projects, not proving anything to anyone. You are not an inconvenience or a complication or something I have to manage around my real priorities. You are my real priority. You are my most important job, and everything else is just details. Emma was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the serious attention she brought to important conversations. But you love working with Victoria, and the accessibility stuff is really important. Yes, I love the work, and yes, it's important. But it's important because it makes the world better for people like you, not because it's more important than you. Marcus squeezed Emma's hand gently. And I think Victoria would be the first person to tell me that missing work to take care of my daughter isn't a professional failure. It's a human responsibility. As if summoned by her name, Marcus's phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. This time, he opened it. How is Emma? Do you need anything? I can handle all work issues indefinitely. Your only job right now is taking care of her and yourself. Marcus showed Emma the message and watched his daughter's expression shift from guilt to something that looked like surprised relief. She's not mad that you left the meeting? Emma, she told me to leave the meeting. She understood immediately that you were more important than anything else we were doing. Emma was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her processing this information. Dad, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think Victoria is lonely? The question caught Marcus off guard. What makes you ask that? The way she talks about work. Like it's everything to her, not just something she does. Emma shifted in the hospital bed, wincing slightly from the surgical site. And the way she looked at us that first day, like she was trying to figure out how we fit together, like family was something she was studying instead of something she had. Marcus thought about Victoria's story, losing her father, ending her engagement, throwing herself into rebuilding her company while learning to navigate the world with a disability. He thought about her careful independence, her reluctance to accept help, her admission that she didn't know how to need people anymore. Maybe, he said carefully, sometimes when people have been hurt, they protect themselves by not getting too close to others. Like me not telling you about the headaches? Marcus felt something click into place. Yeah, sweetheart, exactly like that. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the hospital blanket. Dad, when I'm better, can we invite Victoria for dinner? Like at our apartment, not a work dinner. Why? Because she fixed her life after her accident, and she's helping you fix buildings so they work for people like us. But I don't think anyone is helping her fix the lonely parts. Emma looked up at Marcus with the serious wisdom that sometimes surprised him. And because you smile different when you talk about her. Not just work happy, but actual happy. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. Emma. I'm not stupid, Dad. You like her. And I think she likes you too, but she's scared about it. Emma's voice grew stronger, more confident. Maybe if we show her that needing people doesn't make you broken, she'll figure out how to not be lonely anymore. Before Marcus could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. A nurse appeared, followed by someone Marcus didn't expect to see. Victoria, holding a small bouquet of flowers and looking uncharacteristically uncertain. I hope it's okay that I came, Victoria said, her eyes moving between Marcus and Emma. I brought your favorite kind of cookies, Emma, the ones from the bakery near your school. Emma's face lit up despite the exhaustion and surgical aftermath. You remembered what kind I like? I remember everything about people who matter to me, Victoria said simply, rolling closer to Emma's bed. How are you feeling? Better now. Dad explained that being sick doesn't make me broken, just human. Victoria's eyes met Marcus's over Emma's head, and he saw something pass between them. Understanding, gratitude, and something deeper that made his pulse quicken. Your dad is very smart, Victoria said, and very right. Some of the strongest people I know are the ones who've learned how to ask for help when they need it. Emma studied Victoria's face with the intensity she brought to important puzzles. Is that hard to learn? Victoria was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her choosing her words carefully. Very hard. Sometimes when you've been hurt, you learn to protect yourself by not needing anyone else. But that protection can become its own kind of prison. Victoria glanced at Marcus again, and he saw vulnerability flicker across her expression. I'm still learning how to need people without feeling like I'm losing myself. Maybe, Emma said with the casual wisdom of 12-year-olds, needing people is just another kind of strength, like how I need my wheelchair to get around, but that doesn't make me weak, it makes me mobile. Victoria stared at Emma for a moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression: surprise, recognition, and what looked like the beginning of hope. Emma, Victoria said softly, that might be the wisest thing anyone has ever said to me. Emma beamed, and Marcus felt something warm and complicated settle in his chest as he watched two of the most important people in his life begin to understand that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites, but partners in the complex dance of living a fully human life. Outside Emma's hospital room window, the city spread out in all directions, millions of people navigating spaces that worked for them or didn't, asking for help or learning to do without, building connections or protecting themselves with careful distance. But in this small room, surrounded by medical equipment and the antiseptic smell of institutional care, Marcus felt like something important was beginning. Not just Emma's recovery, but the possibility that all three of them might learn how to need each other without losing themselves in the process. Emma came home from the hospital 3 days later, immediately returning to her laptop to document accessibility barriers. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, scrolling through photos she'd taken from her wheelchair. "The bathroom door in my room was exactly 29 inches wide. ADA minimum is 32 inches. And the bed controls were positioned at standing height. I couldn't reach them without help." Marcus paused in his obsessive inventory of Emma's medications. "You were documenting accessibility violations while you were recovering from surgery?" "Someone has to." Emma's voice carried the matter-of-fact determination that had become her default mode since the accident. "If I don't document it, how will anyone know it needs to be fixed?" Victoria, who had become a daily visitor during Emma's recovery, looked up from the building plans she'd spread across their dining table. "Emma, you realize most 12-year-olds don't conduct accessibility audits of their hospital rooms?" "Most 12-year-olds don't need to." Emma's response was simple and devastating in its honesty. "But if they did, maybe hospitals would work better for everyone." Marcus watched Victoria process this statement, saw something complex move across her expression. Over the past week, Victoria had integrated herself into their domestic routine with surprising ease, bringing work to their apartment so Marcus didn't have to choose between caring for Emma and meeting project deadlines, staying for dinner without being asked, falling into easy conversation with Emma about everything from universal design principles to whether chocolate chip cookies counted as breakfast food if they contained oats. But it was the small moments that revealed how carefully Victoria had been protecting herself from exactly this kind of intimacy. The way she startled when Marcus casually touched her shoulder while reaching for coffee. How she went quiet when Emma asked about her family, then changed the subject with professional smoothness. The careful distance she maintained, even while becoming indispensable to their daily rhythm. "Victoria," Emma said, closing her laptop with the satisfied air of someone who'd completed important work. "Can I ask you something personal?" Victoria tensed slightly but nodded. "Of course." "Do you miss being able to walk?" Marcus felt his breath catch. It was the kind of question adults learned not to ask. The kind of directness that children wielded before they understood that some topics were supposed to be approached obliquely. Victoria was quiet for a long time, her fingers absently straightening the building plans she'd been reviewing. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Marcus had ever heard it. "I miss dancing," she said. "Not walking specifically, but dancing. My dad taught me to waltz when I was 7 years old. He'd put on Nat King Cole and we'd dance around the living room, and he'd tell me that someday I'd dance at my wedding and he'd be proud to watch." Emma listened with the serious attention she gave to important information. "Do you think you'll ever dance again?" "Not the way I used to." Victoria's smile was complicated, holding both sadness and something that might have been acceptance. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe I'll find different ways to move to music." "Like what?" Victoria glanced at Marcus, and he saw something vulnerable flicker across her expression. "I don't know yet. I've been so focused on learning to do everything exactly the way I used to do it, that I haven't really explored what new things might be possible." Emma nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd spent 8 months discovering that life after spinal cord injury was about creation as much as adaptation. "When I first got hurt, I thought I'd never play sports again. But wheelchair basketball is completely different from regular basketball. It's faster and more strategic, And you have to think three-dimensionally about movement and positioning. It's not worse than what I did before, it's just different. And better in some ways? Victoria asked. Better in some ways, Emma confirmed. I'm stronger now. Not just physically, but in my head. I know I can handle hard things, because I've already handled the hardest thing I could imagine. Marcus felt something twist in his chest as he watched his daughter offer hard-won wisdom to a woman who'd been navigating similar challenges in professional isolation. Emma had learned to reframe limitation as opportunity, partly because she was 12, and partly because she'd had support through every stage of her adaptation. Victoria had learned to see her disability as something to be overcome rather than integrated, and Marcus was beginning to understand how lonely that approach had been. Emma, Victoria said carefully, do you ever feel angry about what happened to you? Every day. Emma's honesty was matter-of-fact rather than dramatic. I'm angry at the drunk driver. I'm angry that I can't do some things I used to love. I'm angry that the world isn't built for people like me, and that I have to fight for basic stuff like being able to get into buildings or use bathrooms. She paused, considering. But I'm not angry at my wheelchair or my body or myself. Those things aren't the problem. They're just my reality. Victoria absorbed this distinction with visible concentration. How do you separate anger at circumstances from anger at yourself? Emma looked at Marcus, who realized his daughter was asking permission to share something they'd discussed during her darkest moments after the accident. Dad taught me that anger is information, Emma said. When I'm angry because I can't reach something, that tells me the thing is positioned wrong, not that I'm broken. When I'm angry because people stare at me, that tells me they need education about disability, not that I should hide. And when you're angry at the person who caused the accident? Emma's expression grew serious. That tells me that what happened to me was wrong, and that other people deserve to be protected from drunk drivers. So I do presentations at Dad's work about disability awareness, and I wrote letters to the city council about better accessibility enforcement, and I'm going to be a disability rights lawyer when I grow up. Marcus watched Victoria process this information, saw her recalibrating her understanding of how to live with catastrophic change. Emma had learned to transform her anger into advocacy, her limitations into expertise, her adaptation into strength. Victoria had learned to transform her anger into professional success, but at the cost of personal connection and emotional vulnerability. Victoria, Emma continued with the relentless insight of childhood, why did your fiancé break up with you after your accident? Marcus winced at the directness of the question, but Victoria didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked thoughtful, as if Emma had asked something she'd been wondering about herself. He didn't break up with me, Victoria said slowly. I broke up with him. Why? Victoria was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I could see in his eyes that he was grieving the person I used to be. Every time he looked at me, I could see him remembering the woman who could hike with him on weekends, who could dance at our wedding, who could give him the children we'd planned to have. Victoria's hands tightened on her wheelchair's armrests as she continued, her voice gaining strength even as it revealed pain. Jonathan kept saying the accident didn't change how he felt about me, but I could see the truth in how he touched me, like I might break, like I was something fragile that needed protecting instead of someone he desired. When he proposed the second time, after the accident, it felt like charity, like he was being noble by still wanting damaged goods. Emma's expression grew fierce in the way that reminded Marcus she was still a child who believed in fairness with absolute conviction. That's stupid. You're not damaged goods, you're just you, but with wheels. Victoria's laugh was surprised and genuine. Just me, but with wheels. I like that. Besides, Emma continued with devastating 12-year-old logic, if someone only loves you when everything is perfect, they don't really love you at all. They love the idea of you. Marcus felt his heart skip as Victoria's eyes found his across their daughter's head. Something passed between them, recognition, understanding, and a question that neither of them was quite ready to ask out loud. Emma, Victoria said softly, has anyone ever told you that you're remarkably wise? Dad tells me that when I'm not being remarkably stubborn. Emma grinned, then grew serious again. Victoria, can I tell you something? Always. I think Dad loves you. Not the idea of you, but actually you. The way you get angry about broken elevators, and the way you make buildings work better, and the way you listen to me like what I say matters. Emma's voice carried the casual certainty of someone stating obvious facts. And I think you love him too, but you're scared because you think love means someone has to take care of someone else instead of people taking care of each other. Marcus felt heat flood his face, but before he could intervene, Victoria was speaking. "Emma," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly, "what makes you think your dad loves me?" "Because he smiles with his whole face when you text him. Because he bought coffee that he doesn't even like because it's the kind you drink. Because when you were explaining universal design principles to my class, he looked at you like you were the most amazing person he'd ever seen." Emma paused, studying Victoria's expression. "And because when I was in the hospital, the first person he called was you. Not Mom, not Grandma, you." Marcus realized this was true. When Emma's school had called about the medical emergency, his first instinct had been to reach out to Victoria, not because she could help practically, but because her concern felt as essential as his own. "And I think you love him," Emma continued with relentless insight, "because you've been coming here every day even when you don't have work to do. Because you remember what kind of cookies I like, and that Dad puts too much milk in his coffee. Because yesterday when he fell asleep in the chair while I was napping, you covered him with a blanket and didn't wake him up even though you had meetings to get to." Victoria was staring at Emma with something that looked like wonder and terror. "You noticed all of that?" "I notice everything. It's my superpower." Emma's grin was triumphant. "So are you going to tell each other how you feel, or are you going to keep pretending this is just about accessibility consulting?" The silence that followed was so charged that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Victoria was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before, vulnerable and hopeful and scared all at once. "Emma," Marcus said carefully, "maybe you should. Maybe I should give you two some privacy to have a grown-up conversation." Emma was already maneuvering her wheelchair toward her bedroom. "I have homework anyway, but just so you know, if you mess this up because you're both too scared to need each other, I'm going to be very disappointed in both of you." Emma disappeared into her room with the satisfied air of someone who'd successfully meddled in adult affairs, leaving Marcus and Victoria alone in a silence that felt full of possibility and peril. "She's right, you know," Victoria said finally. "About which part?" "All of it. I am scared. I do love you. And I have no idea how to need someone without losing myself." Victoria rolled closer to where Marcus sat on the couch, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "For 2 years I've been so focused on proving that I'm not diminished that I forgot I might want to be enhanced by someone else's presence in my life." Marcus felt his breath catch. "Victoria?" "Let me finish," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I love the way you see problems as puzzles to be solved, instead of obstacles to be endured. I love that you modified Emma's wheelchair not because you had to, but because you couldn't stand seeing her uncomfortable. I love that you carried her up 10 flights of stairs and never once made her feel like a burden." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer. "And I love that you look at me like I'm capable of anything, like my wheelchair is just part of how I move through the world instead of the most important thing about me. When you explain technical modifications to clients, you include me in the conversation instead of talking around me. When we're working together, you don't try to help me unless I ask, but you're always positioned where I could ask if I needed to." Marcus realized she was right. Somewhere in their weeks of working together, he'd learned to read Victoria's cues, to offer support without assuming incompetence, to trust her expertise while being available for partnership. "I've never been in love with someone who uses a wheelchair," Marcus said quietly. "I was worried I'd do something wrong, say something insensitive, make assumptions that would hurt you." "Have you? Made assumptions that hurt me?" Marcus thought back through their weeks together. Professional meetings, shared meals, quiet moments of conversation. "I don't think so, but I've been careful, maybe too careful." "What do you mean?" Marcus felt heat rise in his face. "I mean, I've wanted to touch you, hold your hand, kiss you, all the normal things people do when they're falling in love, but I was afraid you'd think I was treating you like you were fragile." Victoria's smile was radiant. "Marcus, I want all of those things too. The reason I've been keeping distance isn't because I don't want intimacy. It's because I want it too much. I was afraid that if I let myself need you, I'd lose the independence I fought so hard to build. And now?" Victoria reached for his hand, her fingers interlacing with his with easy familiarity. "Now I think maybe independence and interdependence aren't opposites. Maybe they're both just different ways of being strong." Marcus lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to Victoria's knuckles. Emma's going to be insufferably smug about being right. Emma is remarkable. She's learned things about disability and strength and self-advocacy that took me 2 years to figure out, and she's only 12. She's had help figuring it out. You didn't. Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. I had help available. I just couldn't accept it because I thought accepting help meant accepting defeat. She paused. What changed your mind? About me, I mean. About taking the risk of caring about someone whose life is complicated by disability. Marcus considered the question seriously. I don't think your life is complicated by disability. I think your life is shaped by disability, the same way my life is shaped by being a single father. Both of those things create challenges and opportunities and perspectives that make us who we are. He shifted on the couch so he was facing Victoria more directly. What changed my mind was watching you advocate for Emma and kids like her with the same fierce protectiveness I feel for my daughter. You weren't doing accessibility consulting. You were fighting for Emma's right to exist fully in the world. That's when I realized I wasn't falling in love with someone despite their disability. I was falling in love with someone whose experience of disability had made them into exactly the person I wanted to build a life with. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus saw tears gathering in her eyes. I've spent 2 years thinking that if someone could love me after my accident, it would be a consolation prize, she said finally. I never considered that someone might love me because of how the accident changed me, because of what I learned about strength and advocacy and refusing to accept a world that doesn't work for everyone. Victoria, Marcus said, moving closer, can I kiss you? Her answer was to close the distance between them, her hands framing his face as their lips met. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative with newness and the weight of everything they'd been afraid to want. But as Victoria's wheelchair bumped against the couch and Marcus's hands found the soft skin at the nape of her neck, the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure simultaneously. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Marcus realized that all his careful worries about physical intimacy with someone who used a wheelchair had been replaced by the simple human reality of wanting someone specific and wonderful and complicated. So, Victoria said, her voice slightly unsteady, what happens now? Now we figure out how to build a life together that works for all three of us, Marcus said. We modify and adapt and problem solve, the same way we do with buildings and wheelchairs and accessibility challenges. Victoria laughed. Are you comparing our relationship to an engineering project? I'm comparing our relationship to the best kind of engineering project, the kind where you take existing structures and make them work better for everyone involved. From Emma's bedroom came the sound of enthusiastic applause. Finally, Emma called out, I was starting to think you two were never going to figure it out. Marcus and Victoria looked at each other and burst into laughter. Emma, Marcus called back, were you listening to our entire conversation? Only the important parts. Emma's voice was unrepentant. And just so you know, I think you should get married and have more kids, so I can teach them about disability advocacy from birth, instead of having to learn it after an accident. Victoria's eyes widened. She doesn't waste time, does she? Emma has never wasted time in her life, Marcus confirmed. But she's not wrong about the marriage part. Not immediately, he added quickly, seeing Victoria's expression. But eventually, if you want to. Victoria's smile was soft and complicated and full of hope. Ask me again in 6 months, when we've figured out how to merge our lives without losing our independence. Deal. Emma appeared in her doorway, grinning with the satisfaction of someone whose meddling had been successful. So, are we having dinner together? Like, as a family? Marcus looked at Victoria, who nodded with the kind of decisive confidence she brought to business negotiations and accessibility battles. Yes, Victoria said, as a family. The grand opening of the Morrison building drew crowds that spilled onto the sidewalks of downtown. Marcus stood near the entrance, watching people stream through doors that were wide enough for wheelchairs, walkers, and anyone carrying large packages. The elevator buttons were positioned at accessible heights, the bathroom facilities met full ADA compliance, and the emergency evacuation system included provisions for people with mobility limitations. What made Marcus proudest was watching how naturally everyone moved through the space. The building worked for everyone because it had been designed with everyone in mind. Dad, look! Emma called out from across the lobby. She was racing toward him in her new basketball wheelchair the custom model Victoria had commissioned for her 13th birthday. The turning radius in this lobby is perfect for wheelchair basketball. We could totally hold practice here. Victoria appeared beside Emma, her business suit replaced by jeans and a t-shirt that read, "Accessibility is not optional." She looked relaxed in a way Marcus had never seen during their professional working relationship. Still competent and confident, but without the careful armor she'd worn during their early meetings. "How does it feel?" Victoria asked Marcus, gesturing toward the bustling lobby. "Like everything we fought for was worth it," Marcus replied, pulling her close and pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Over the past year, they'd worked on 12 building projects together, testified before City Council about accessibility enforcement, and presented at 3 conferences about universal design principles. But more importantly, they'd learned how to build a life together that honored both their independence and their interdependence. Victoria had learned to ask for help with things like reaching high shelves and carrying heavy boxes, not because she couldn't figure out alternatives, but because accepting assistance was a normal part of human relationships. Marcus had learned to offer support without assuming incompetence, to trust Victoria's expertise while being available for partnership. Emma had thrived with 2 adults who understood that disability was a fact of life rather than a tragedy to be overcome. She'd joined the wheelchair basketball team, started a disability awareness club at school, and begun working with Victoria on a project to audit playground accessibility throughout the city. Mr. Chen, a young woman, approached with a notepad and the eager expression of a journalism student. "I'm writing an article about this project for the university paper. Could I ask you a few questions about universal design principles?" Marcus glanced at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. Over the past year, they'd learned to share the advocacy load, taking turns with public speaking and media interviews. "Of course," Marcus said. "But first, let me introduce you to the real experts. This is Victoria Hartwell, who runs the accessibility consulting firm that made this project possible, and this is my daughter Emma, who's been conducting independent accessibility audits since she was 12 years old." As Victoria and Emma fell into easy conversation with the reporter, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find David, Victoria's assistant, holding a bottle of champagne and grinning. "Congratulations," David said. "This project is going to change everything. The city's already planning to use these standards for all future public buildings." "It's not just about buildings," Marcus replied, watching Victoria explain technical modifications to the reporter while Emma demonstrated proper wheelchair etiquette. "It's about changing how people think about human diversity, making accommodation feel normal instead of special." David followed his gaze to Victoria and Emma. "You know, I've worked for Victoria for 4 years, and I've never seen her as happy as she's been this past year. She's still brilliant and demanding, but she's also lighter somehow, like she's not carrying everything alone anymore." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what David meant. Victoria still approached problems with fierce competence, but she'd learned to share both the burden and the satisfaction of solving them. She still maintained her independence, but she'd discovered that needing people didn't diminish her strength, it multiplied it. "Dad!" Emma called out, racing back toward them with Victoria close behind. "The reporter wants to know if we're going to write a book about accessibility advocacy. Should we?" Marcus looked at Victoria, who shrugged with the kind of casual confidence that had replaced her careful professional armor. "Why not?" Victoria said. "We've learned a few things worth sharing." "Like what?" the reporter asked, pencil poised. Emma answered first, with the directness that had become her trademark. "Like how love isn't about fixing people or taking care of them. It's about building a life together that works for everyone involved." Victoria added, "And how accessibility isn't about accommodating disabled people. It's about designing a world that works for human bodies as they actually exist, not as we imagine they should exist." Marcus thought about everything they'd learned in the past year, about strength and vulnerability, independence and interdependence, the difference between helping and enabling, the way love could enhance rather than diminish individual capability. "And," Marcus said, pulling his family close, "how sometimes the best solutions come from understanding that broken systems are opportunities for innovation, not obstacles to overcome." As the celebration continued around them, people moving easily through spaces designed for inclusion, conversations happening at eye level regardless of whether participants stood or sat, children playing together without noticing differences in mobility, Marcus realized that their story wasn't really about disability at all. It was about learning to build a world where everyone could thrive, where human diversity was seen as strength rather than complication, where love meant enhancing each other's capabilities rather than compensating for perceived limitations. It was about fixing hearts by learning to see brokenness not as failure but as information, data about what needed to be redesigned, rebuilt, and reimagined. And as Emma raced off to show her friends the accessible features of their latest project, and Victoria fell into animated discussion with city planners about future accessibility initiatives, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, love that enhanced rather than diminished, and the knowledge that they were building something that would last long after they were gone. The Morrison Building would serve thousands of people over its lifetime, providing equal access to office space, retail opportunities, and community services. But more than that, it would serve as proof that accessibility wasn't a burden to be grudgingly accepted, but a design principle that made everything work better for everyone. Just like love, when you got it right. Thank you for taking the time to experience this story of love, resilience, and building a better world together. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that matter.